Well, hello, this is Mrs. Becky again, and I'm going to be going over IXL pre-calculus section G1, which is going over rational functions. We're going to talk about the asymptotes and excluded values on the graph as well as in the equation of a rational function. Um, what I like to think of as rational functions, or the word rational reminds me of the word ratio, if you can remember from years gone by when you guys learned about ratios, but ratios are the same thing as fractions. So they have a numerator and a denominator. And um, Fractions are just really things that are divided or broken, as if like when you fracture your arm, it's broken. So one thing that we know about rational functions, when they show up on the graph, they show up broken. I'll try to sketch this line. So part of the graph will show up over here, and the other part is going to show up over here. What happens is better than how I can draw it, but it creates these excluded areas on the graph. These blue parts where the graph shows up will get super, super close to these invisible lines we call asymptotes, but it'll never ever cross them. Kind of like there's that guy in The Lord of the Rings, you shall not pass. They don't pass them. Well, sometimes they do on the horizontal, but vertical asymptotes, they don't. But we'll get into that more later. So we're going to do some work looking for these on graphs as well as in the equation. So a rational um, function is in this form that you see right here. That's called the standard form, where you will have the x variable will be in the denominator, and the vertical asymptote is going to be this number over here. I'm sorry, horizontal is going to be over here. Any number that's going to be added or subtracted to this fraction, um, that's going to be the horizontal asymptote. And the vertical asymptote is going to be any number in the denominator that's added or subtracted to the x variable. So we can spot them like that. Um, okay, I'll talk about that in a second. All right, so the first example we're going to look at is this graph, and it will ask you what is the equation of the horizontal asymptote. So horizontal is going to be the y value. So it is going to go across the y-axis. So you look at your graph and you're going to see where is the graph not showing up horizontally, and then you just find that value, and it's right at 2. So where y equals 2, the graph does not show up. That's your horizontal asymptote. Then it's going to also ask you what is the equation of the vertical asymptote. Vertical goes up and down. I'm kind of dyslexic, so I always get those mixed up. So the vertical asymptote is going to be an x value. Where does it not show up vertically here? We can just look at it pretty closely and see that when x equals 0, on the x-axis, when x is at 0, you're not going to be able to find anything where the graph shows up. Now, it's also going to ask you what is the excluded value. That's going to be an x value, and it's going to be the same thing as the vertical asymptote. So the excluded value is x equals 0. And to explain that to you a little bit better, when we have a simple fraction, such as 6 divided by 3, break it down really simple, we know that that equals 2. And that works mathematically because the inverse is also true. We can then say 3 times 2 equals 6. That that works perfectly. But you can have an excluded value. You never ever in math want to have a 0 in the denominator. I'll show you why. 6 divided by 0 equals 0, right? Right. But you can't do the inverse. 0 times 0 does not equal 6. So that's an excluded value. You can never have anything that's going to end up giving you a 0 in the denominator. And we'll talk about that more when we start looking at the equation over here. All right, on this one, what is the equation of the horizontal asymptote? Horizontally goes this way, so it's easier for me to see at the end of the graph. And that's going to be where y equals 0. And the equation of the vertical asymptote is an x value. So we're looking vertically like this. And, ooh, that was really bad. I can't let that stand. Let me try again. Mm, never said I was an artist. And that's going to be at 1, 2, -2. So where x is -2, that's where you can find that asymptote. Excluded value is going to be the same thing. When x is -2, and whatever equation that is, it's going to zero out the denominator and it's going to cause that break in the graph. Ugh. All right, let's look at example number 3. What is the equation of the horizontal asymptote? That is horizontal goes this way. Not even going to try to draw that. That horizontal asymptote is way down here where y equals -5. And the vertical is going to be an x value. Vertically, it's going to be right here. And that one is at x equals 4. And the excluded value, again, is going to be the exact same thing as the vertical asymptote. That's going to be x equals 4. All right, next one, the horizontal is a y value, and that's going to be right here at y equals 4. And the x asymptote is going to be also at 4. And we know that that gives us our excluded value is going to be at x equals 4. Now, when we start looking at the equation written out like this, we can also find, the different information, the horizontal and the vertical asymptotes off this equation. And like I told you before, vertical asymptotes zero out the denominator. So you're looking for what number could you plug in for x that would make this equal 0. So as they get more complex, you could just take your equation, set it to equal 0, and solve it. So if you add 7 to both sides, you move get rid of your -7, add 7 to both sides. That's going to give you x equals 0. So the vertical asymptote is going to be at x equals 0. This problem doesn't ask, but this number hanging out right here is going to be your horizontal asymptote. So this one should show up at y is 8. And here's a different type of problem. What is the equation of the horizontal asymptote? Remember, the horizontal asymptote shows over here, it's that number that is going to be added or subtracted to the whole fraction. What can you add to this thing that's not going to change the value of it at all? Well, it's going to be 0. So if we just stick a +0 over there, then we can see the horizontal asymptote is at y equals 0. Now for the vertical, that's found in the denominator. So what number, this is being multiplied 7 times what number would make this equal 0? So you could do 7x if you're going to do the equation, set it to equal 0, and then you want to solve for x. So what we want to do is, these are being multiplied, so divide by 7, because that cancels that out. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. Divide by 7. So 0 divided by 7 equals 0. So again, if you plugged in a 0 right here, that would cause the denominator to equal 0, which causes a asymptote in the denominator. So again, that excluded value, like x could never be 0. So that's going to be x equals 0 for the excluded value on that one. I'm trying to pause it. Why don't you go ahead and pause the video if you want, and you can see if you can figure these out on your own. And then I'll come back and we'll work them out together. All right. Well, what we have here then, what is the equation of the horizontal asymptote? It's going to be a y value, y equals. Again, the horizontal one is the number that's hanging out over here. We can add a 0 without changing this at all. So it's going to be y equals 0. Vertical asymptote is going to be found in the denominator. What number could you plug in for x that's going to zero that out? Well, obviously it's a 4 because 4 minus 4 equals 0. But if it's difficult, more difficult problem, you can always just set it to 0 and just solve it. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. So we're going to end up with x equals 4. So the vertical asymptote is going to be x equals 4. That excluded value would be x equals 4. If x ever showed up as 4, that's just a no-go right there. All right. Equation of the horizontal asymptote, that one hangs over here. Could be a 0. On IXL, you are going to find some that do have a number there, but these are easy peasy. Y equals 0. And again, on the vertical, an x value, well, it's going to be 0. If you plug in a 0 there, it's going to zero that out. Excluded value is also 0. And I think that's all the examples that I have for you. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. And thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye.